All right, my task this morning is to talk about soybean agronomy. And before I started, I'd like to acknowledge the contributors to this presentation. They include Hans Cadell, our extension agronomist. He and I coordinate a lot of the soybean educational activities with extension. And then I'd also like to recognize the Research Extension Center research agronomists who contributed much of the data that you'll be seeing today during our visit. And then certainly the North Dakota Soybean Council was a major financial supporter for a lot of the research that we'll be showing you. About a year ago, we revised a pocket guide in soybean production, and this is what it looks like. The pocket guide is available from extension offices, or there's an electronic version available as well. So for my subjects, it's pretty straightforward. I want to give an introduction, talk a bit about variety selection, and then also a bit on cover crops. And then the main component of my talk will be on plant growth stages and then associated production recommendations. Emphasis will be on plant establishment, starting from pre-planting actually, and then going up to the R1 stages. So variety selection is, of course, quite important. And at the top of the list is yield, which is everybody's goal. There's a lot of other things to consider, and so the bolded items are those that I'll talk about briefly. And I'll just emphasize that maybe a lot of producers have already chosen their varieties, but it's really good to do your homework, because the time a person puts in to study the material can really provide some good paybacks on increased yield potential. So I'm sure everyone's aware that each year we have an updated version of our soybean variety guide that shows results from across the state. So we hope you use that as one of your resources as you select varieties. And that's a nice complement to the industry varieties and the details that they have. So I'd like to give you an example of utilizing a bit of the data from our guide just to illustrate how important it is on taking the time to study the data carefully and what paybacks it can actually provide. My voice is a little scratchy this morning, so I'll do the best I can to be loud and somewhat clear. So this is a database from Minot, from the North Central Research Extension Centers, from their 2019 variety trial. And it includes the various herbicide-resistant types, Roundup Ready, glyphosate-tolerant, Extend, and Enlist. So there's a total of 47 varieties. There's a lot of different companies, universities that had submissions. The trial average was 48. It's a range. So we hopefully, if persons are using this database for future, that they're going to be on the upper end of this range. So the base of this is just the CDL increase in percentage. This is the CDL increase based on percentage versus the trial average. And so if we were fortunate enough to choose a very highest yielding variety in this database, look at the yield increase compared to the trial average, 23 bushels. But something more realistic would be is just choosing a variety that was statistically higher than the trial average. So in this case, 5.5 bushels greater than the 48 would be a certainly reasonable goal. And if a person did that, there's 10% increase in yield potential. So as I show you some other factors on establishing the plants, none of them will reach 10%. So just an example to emphasize how important it is to do your homework because the paybacks can be very good. During the period of 2014 through 17, we had an extensive survey led by Hans Cadell of over 1,000 fields in North Dakota. There's lots of data generated. This is just one small piece of it, but it just shows the increase in yield potential as a person selects a longer maturing variety. And so North Dakota is a short season, of course, and we don't want our soybean crop to quit before the season is over. On the flip side, of course, we don't want a variety to go too far and not reach maturity before a killing frost. So there's a balance there. But if we do well on selecting our maturity group, we can see a nice benefit. Based on this data from the survey, we see a 3/4 bushel higher yield for each 0.1 increase in the group rating. But I would mention that there are some varieties sometimes that are short of maturity that are very good yielders. So again, it goes back to studying the data carefully. And then, of course, we have a lot of selections for herbicide-resistant traits. And so I just want to emphasize that we need to take our time considering these options. And it is complicated. Also, keep in mind that we want to deal with the entire crop sequence in the field or your farm. And so, yes, we want to have weed management as a goal, but also keep in mind we don't want to sacrifice such agronomic things as yield or other factors like disease tolerance in order to optimize weed management using these traits. All right, so enough said on yield. I want to move on to cover crops. And I'm joking here a little bit, but this is not my definition of cover crops. What I'm referring to, of course, would be a situation like this, where we had the opportunity to grow cover crops in the prior fall, or maybe even in the spring, to help with such things as protecting the soil from erosion, some moisture management, as well as weed suppression. And there's quite a number of other goals as well. So in this case, there was rye that was planted in the fall. It was timely killed in the spring, probably close to soybean harvesting or soybean planting. And we have a very nice environment there for productive soybeans. And then another option, of course, would be to plant cover crops toward the end of the soybean season. Actually broadcast at R7, for example, and then hopefully get a take on the cover crops to provide some of the same benefits I mentioned earlier, or even planting the cover crop after the soybeans are harvested if the harvest occurs early enough in the fall or late summer. So I want to show you just a couple examples, some research we're doing. This one is from Carrington, and it shows the impact of termination time of winter rye in relationship to soybean planting. So during this period of 2013 through 17, we had 9 different evaluations or trials. And what we found was if we terminated the rye 2 weeks or earlier before soybean planting, that gave us the best chance of keeping our yields similar to the untreated check where no rye was present. And the reason we found this is because a number of the years we had relatively dry soil moisture in the spring, and so we had to be really careful about the rye not using too much moisture and actually reducing the soybean yield. On the flip side, if we can keep the rye growing as long as we can, even up to soybean planting or maybe even beyond, that gives us more benefit for the cover crop, more protection from soil erosion and certainly weed suppression and others as well, maybe even better soil moisture management if we're in an excessive soil condition. And I think most people are going into 2020. So this may actually give us opportunity to plant green, meaning that we could plant the soybeans right into living rye and then gain more benefits of having the rye in the system. But again, be careful about that. We got to monitor our soil moisture conditions quite vigilantly. And then another bit of work that we're doing is looking at the tolerance of cover crops to previous applied soybean herbicides. If a person had the goal of planting cover crops toward the end of the soybean season or after, certainly there'd be concerns about what soybean herbicides were used and their impact on the cover crops selected. And so we're trying to build a database on that, and we're doing that. So our current work is listed toward the bottom of the slide, and it shows the herbicides that we're using, and then also the cover crops that we're planting in late summer, early fall to see what their tolerance is to these previously applied herbicides with soil residual. And so ultimately, there was cover crop injury to essentially all of the herbicides. Those cover crops that seem to see or have the least amount of tolerance or most susceptible would be radish, turnip, and rapeseed. On the flip side, those cover crops most tolerant appear to be barley and winter rye, and then field pea and flax. So ultimately our goal is to have a nice, easy to interpret table printed in the 2021 Weed Control Guide as a reference if cover crops are your goal with your soybean production system. So now we'll get into the soybean growth and related production considerations. And so this is a guide available to you electronically if you wish. And this was actually taken by permission from Iowa State. They have a very extensive guide called Soybean Growth and Development. And so we try to simplify it in our North Dakota guide, and including information that relates to the biology of the plants, and in particular in some management considerations at the various growth stages. So we'll be looking at components of this circular as we go through the discussion. So of course we have two major growth stages in soybean. We're going to start with the vegetative stages. And so I'm doing this because this understanding the growth stages and certainly the biology behind the growth stages will help give us some information to allow us to more intensely manage our soybean, ultimately with the goals of more efficiently increasing yield. Okay, and then most of our management, at least agronomy-wise, is related to or associated with vegetative stages. So quite a few years ago, we tried to track soybean plant development. So this is a summary of that work that was done at Carrington, and I think it's still very relevant no matter where a person is in the state. But on average, we saw about 50 days being required from planting until first flower, or the R1 stage. And this will be plus or minus about 5 days. And then the balance of the season from R1 to full maturity requires about 70 days. We have another resource too to help track or estimate maturity of soybeans. And this is found on NDON. If you go to the applications section, all you need to do is select your location, the relative maturity or maturity group of your soybean, and then the planting date. And after you do that, it'll give you a nice little graph like this that estimates the time for maturity and then the long-term predictions on when first frost occurs, killing frost, etc. So it might be a useful tool for you during the growing season. Okay, so back to the crop stages. Our first stage would be VE for plant emergence. And so when the seed is placed in the ground, the first thing that happens immediately is that the seed takes up half its weight in water. And then after the water intake is completed, well then the germination process is initiated, as long as we have soil temperatures at a base of about 50 degrees. So the radicle, the main root comes out, and then the hypocotyl will soon after start elongating, and that'll pull the cotyledon leaves or seed leaves out of the soil. And so the growing point at that time is all above the soil. There's nothing below the soil. So if we have any bad things happen, so if the hypocotyl is cut off near or at the soil line, we have no opportunity for regrowth of the plant. So once these seed leaves are open, this is VE stage, and then soon after, the stem will develop from the epicotyl, which is above the node where the seed was attached. Okay, if you look at the figure on the left-hand side of this slide, the next stage that I'm not showing is the VC stage that stands for the cotyledon. but actually it's the unifoliate leaves are out. They're opposite in arrangement, and you notice that there's axillary buds present at where the leaf is attached to the stem. And actually the same is true with the cotyledon leaves and all subsequent leaves. So there's lots of opportunities for regrowth if something bad does happen, some type of defoliation, as long as it occurs above where the cotyledons were attached. So what can we do about management here? One thing that comes to mind is ground rolling. If a person is delayed for any reason where the crop is actually emerged before the ground is rolled, if you desire that practice, we found with research both by NDSU and the University of Minnesota that rolling at the unifoliate stage is a very good timing. At that time, the plant is very small. It can tolerate the rolling, and there's at least 4 sets of growing points, or 4 growing points present for regrowth if there was some damage that occurred. We have found in research waiting to the V1 stage, the first trifoliate stage, there becomes quite a bit more injury. And even though it didn't impact yield with increased injury at the first trifoliate stage or beyond, it certainly opens the door to more stem lodging, more disease, infections, etc. Okay, and then when the trifoliate leaflets are open, the edges are not touching, then we call this the V1 stage. And so the first trifoliate leaf will be on the second node of the plant. And by now you've probably looked at the narrative, but there's quite a few things happening even when the plant is so small. The primary root system is developing, this lateral root system. You may find nodules this early, but they're really not active until we add another leaf or 2 of the trifoliate leaves. And the plant up to this point has been relying primarily on the energy that's been stored in the cotyledons. But once the trifoliates come out, well, then it's equipped to start capturing the sunlight and beginning the photosynthesis. And it even began with unifoliate leaves, but it gears up as we add more trifoliate leaves, of course. And if any leaves are taken off, that activates these axillary buds to take over for the loss of the leaves. And then we'll move along to V5 when we have 5 enfolded trifoliate leaves. And so at this point, these lateral roots, they can actually reach all the way across a 30-inch row. But I'll kid and say that, well, we don't worry about that so much because we plant in narrow rows to increase their yield potential, right? Well, we'll talk about that a little bit later. And so up to V5, there can be a lot of branching that's starting to occur. And then with each branch, it can do the same thing as the main stem of the plant. It can produce leaves and flowers, pods, and eventually seeds. At the V5 stage, normally in North Dakota, we're rapidly approaching the R1 stage when flowering is occurring. And so if that happens, well then some of the axillary buds, especially in this part of the main stem of the plant, will produce flowers. What if hail occurred at this time? There'd be very minimal potential yield loss. If we had 50% loss of the leaves, we'd only expect like 2 or 3% yield loss. Of course, it will set the plant back, and that's of concern as well. So getting to management, I'm going to spend a fair amount of time with this table that we've compiled through the years. So this is a listing of 9 soybean plant establishment factors. The factors are listed, and then we have option A, which we would encourage you to utilize versus option B, and the yield advantage with option A, and that's based on the average of the trial number listed on the right-hand column. So I'm showing this as a starting point because it's a starting point, and then it's up to you as a farmer or crop advisor to fine-tune this based on your experiences with a particular farm or a specific field. But we're very confident in this database that this is a really good starting point to help a person keep their yield potential up there. So I'm going to go through and talk about those factors that have black print, and then those factors in green, the planting date, rate, and row spacing, we'll investigate those with more detail. So quickly, I'll just go through the factors and see how this chart is providing the information. For example, tillage system, we found on average of 37 different trials through the last 2 decades that when we have some type of reduced till, it might be no-till, maybe strip till, we see on average about a 4% yield increase compared to conventional tillage. Does this happen? But on dry years, definitely we see this advantage. Even in the East, previous crop, we see on average, if we have something other than soybean as a prior crop, we see some yield advantages. The average of 6 trials indicate wheat before soybean provide a yield advantage of 5%. I'm using percent instead of bushels per acre because we might be dealing with a trial that has a 20 bushel average and then another one that might be dealing with 60 bushel. And so that confounds the information. So that's why I'm using percent. And then moving downward a little further, if a person consistently uses seed fungicide, our almost 30 trials, when average, will show a 6% yield increase. And by the way, these numbers may change, but with the substantial database that we have, it's unlikely to change a whole lot, even if we had more trials in the future, which we likely will. And then there's a couple other items, two relating to plant nutrition. Chris will talk about this, or attempt to, again. But I just want to show you, we have a database of 16 trials where we inoculated seed with a prior soybean history, primarily just 1 year of a different crop between soybean crops. And when we averaged all the data, we saw a modest average of 2% yield increase by inoculating. But certainly inoculating can be debated, and that's why I have the yes a bit in a gray area. And then P application, planting time. In general, we recommend broadcast application, but our data, which averages 7 trials, is showing a very modest yield increase with broadcast phosphorus versus banding away from the seed. And then we would hope everyone is using or planning to use a soil-applied herbicide. We have 8 trials that indicate in an environment where we did not have resistant weeds, at least resistant to glyphosate, that when we started clean at planting, we saw a 5% yield increase versus waiting until the weeds were 2 to 4 inches tall before we made the appropriate herbicide applications. Okay, so let's look at these 3 factors a little more in detail. Notice with planting date, we have an average of 15 trials, and all of these trials in general are across the state. Definitely this one is. This includes work in the West as well as the East. And we see on average a 6% yield increase by planting essentially the first 10 days in May or earlier versus the last half of May. So what about this early planting? You might be concerned that we'll have a early spring, and rightly so. But if the scenario exists where we can plant early, in the East at least, we see some nice yield advantages, essentially without any additional input costs. We just need to prioritize our cool season crops, of course. But in 11 state years of data during the years listed, we see on average a 10% yield increase by planting the first week in May versus planting 2 weeks later in the mid part of May. But of course, there's some considerations. And one is that soil tilth was adequate, and soil temperatures, especially after the trial was planted, the soil temperature was around 50 degrees. We would be concerned if we had a cold rain after planting that could be taken up by the seed and actually damage the seed and reduce stands. So we try to avoid that during these trials. Some other considerations would be that what if we have a late spring frost? That could be detrimental with this type of strategy. Or there may be crop insurance restrictions. And if a person does this, we would strongly recommend a fungicide seed treatment and also a soil-applied herbicide, because we're going to expect a delay in emergence with this early planting versus later May, when maybe the soil temperatures are closer to 60 than they are 50. But the rest of the story is, and this is preliminary data, but it's from Western North Dakota, that at least 4 site years that I've investigated showing actually a reduced yield and planting in early May versus during mid-May. And I think it's likely due to no-till being so much more common in the West, and particularly in these trials, where we have soil temps that don't warm as quickly. And certainly in no-till environment, if plants emerge, we have a frost, it seems like the plants in no-till are more susceptible. And I've heard that from growers, even in the south central part of North Dakota. So that'd be my explanation for this. But again, this is preliminary, and we'll look at more data as it becomes generated. So back to the survey to go along the same lines of planting date. So again, this is over 1,000 fields throughout North Dakota. And in general, they found, when they averaged the data, that there was actually a loss of about 1/3 bushel per acre per day after the soil was fit for planting. And if there was delay, well, then that's where these losses would show up based on this survey data. So in other words, if a person has opportunity soil-wise to plant to May 10th, but decide to wait until the 20th, there might be some yield loss associated with that delay. All right, so NDSU over long term has recommended established soybean stand of 150,000 plants per acre for any row spacing. And we have enough data where we need to explore that and maybe fine tune it. But as of today, this is still our recommendation. And our data is also indicating that if we have 10 to 12% less from this 150,000, we're still in good shape. It just might require a little bit more management. Again, I apologize for my voice. It's not getting any stronger, but I'm doing the best I can. Okay, this is a visual showing a bit of a theory, but if we have a goal of establishing 150,000 plants, and each plant would be equidistant, which would seem to be ideal for being able to optimizing the capture of sunlight and moisture and nutrients, well, then it means that there would be a configuration of 6 to 7 inches. Meaning that a row spacing of 6 or 7 inches would, at least on paper, seem to be ideal for optimizing yield potential. Well, let's look at some data and see what that shows. There's lots of data, as you probably realize from the establishment table I showed you earlier, but I'll just show you a couple selected pieces of information. So this is from Minot, the North Central Research Extension Center, and this is an average of 5 trials conducted in 2015. So note that when we compared the yield with 1,000 pure seeds per acre versus 150, we saw, well, this database indicates a 13% yield increase going from here to here. And if we wanted to go from 150 to 200, there was additional 4% increase. But most people want to go this way, not this way. And then just one selected slide showing only row spacing. This was 8 site years of work done quite a few years ago, but it's classical work from Minot, Carrington, and Oaks, so across the state. And notice that we did see a yield increase with the intermediate row spacing versus wide in the tune of about 4% yield advantage here. And then if we compare solid seeded to wide rows, this shows a 7% yield increase. So to look at the summary, just comparing with planting rate, if we go with more of a normal planting rate, notice this is pure life seed per acre, we see on average of 44 trials, a 6% yield increase compared to reducing the planting rate. With row spacing, 24 trials, and the data is not as consistent as the planting rate. But we do see a yield advantage with the intermediate row spacing as compared to the wide rows in the tune of 4%. Okay, next I'd like to show you a number of factors, not just one or the other. And so we're going to start with some data from the eastern part of the state. It was done about a decade ago. It's 8 site years of data, and it's showing the influence of 3 factors as listed. So we compared 14 and 28 inch rows, 150 or 200,000 pure life seeds per acre. And then we also included foliar application of specialty products. They included a mixture of many different nutrients, also a fungicide, and also a foliar growth promoter. And so you see that if you make side-by-side comparisons, for example, if we use this treatment and then increase the planting rate to here, there was a yield increase. And you can make whatever comparisons you want in this, but when we apply the economics to this, considering the yield increases minus extra costs, the buck stopped right there at the intermediate row spacings and 150,000 pure light seeds per acre. Well, that was in the East. How about in the West? Well, these are just selected databases, but here's some data from 2017 from Williston. A lower yield environment, but note on row spacing that the narrow rows did statistically show a yield increase. However, plant population did not influence yield, at least in this particular trial. And then at Henniger in very recent years, 2018 and last year, this shows only the row spacing influence on yield, but the study does include planting rate, and I'll show you that in the next slide. So in 2018, average yielding year, there was no influence of row spacing on yield. But the story was different this past season. There was a nice yield response with the narrow rows. So this is Henniger this past season showing both factors. And so you notice the trends here for the 7-inch rows providing greater yield. And also if you look at both row spacings, there seems to be a leveling out of the yield when we approach 140 to 150 or so thousand seeds per acre. When we apply the statistics, there was actually a big area where there was no difference in yield, meaning that if we were to err, we could err certainly on the conservative side. But overall, our database is indicating that clearly there is potential for higher yields as the row spacings narrow and as our planting rates are placed in order to achieve that 150,000 plants per acre. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit more about row spacing of plant populations. So are there any free farming inputs? Well, according to Dwayne Beck, there is. Sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide. So let's think about that a little more in relationship to canopy closure. So I'd like to challenge you as farmers or crop advisors. Excuse me, I'm going to take a drink of water and see if that'll help. So I'd like to challenge you to see if you can achieve field canopy closure by first flower or R1 stage. That's a tall order, but do you think you can achieve it with wide rows? I don't think so. So that means a canopy closure in at least the first half of July. And so what's good about that, the sooner we can close the canopy, the more equipped the plants are to capture sunlight and probably hold moisture because the ground will be shaded instead of exposed to soil or moisture evaporating from the soil. Plus we have a earlier period for our weed competition to give you some examples of the advantage. And then ultimately, we really feel that it does translate into higher yield potential. So to give you a little glimpse of some data relating to that, this is some work done on the eastern part of the state. We looked at 2 row spacings and 2 plant populations. And so we monitored when the canopy closed. And as you maybe would forecast, the closure came quickest with 14-inch rows and 200,000 seeds per acre. So we call this day 1. But on the next day, we achieved the same with the lower plant population. And the relationship with the plant population was essentially the same with the wide rows. But the story here is look at the delay in canopy closure with the wide rows versus the intermediate row spacing. So we're losing almost a month of efficiency by that slower canopy closure. And ultimately, that's reasons for a decline in yield with the wider rows, in general at least. Another concern or reason why people plant wide rows is because of Sclerotinia. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So here's the question. How much white mold needs to be present for wide rows to have a yield advantage over narrow rows based on our discussion so far? So this is information from Michael Wunsch, our Carrington Center plant pathologist. And so this graph each dot represents a soybean variety tested. And so on the x-axis, the positive yield numbers indicate where there was a yield increase with the intermediate row spacing, 21 or 22 and a half, versus the wide rows. And so to make this simple, notice that, well, first I should say on the y-axis is Sclerotinia incidence. And so look, we had instances where a variety had 40% incidence, and yet because it was in the intermediate row spacing, it still had a yield advantage compared to the same variety grown in wide rows. And so our summation from this data indicates that we really need to have at least 50% incidence before it would be beneficial to plant in 30-inch rows versus narrower rows. And so think about on dryland soybeans, how often do you see every other plant that has Sclerotinia? Maybe last year in 2019, but that last year broke all the rules. So please keep that in mind as you consider going with wide rows versus something narrower. All right, so let's move on to the reproductive stage. And so with the reproductive stage, I think of this as every odd number, like R1, R3, et cetera, is the start of something new happening with the plant. And then, of course, in general, in the reproductive stage, we are our emphasis is moving away from agronomy more on plant protection. For example, we may wrap up some weed management yet. Certainly we'd be soon looking for soybean aphids, and we would be scouting for diseases during this period as well. And of course, the speakers that follow will address some of these issues. So what I'm really saying is that I'll spend more time on the growth staging, description, and biology, and less on management. I'll leave that to other folks. So we'll go through the stages. Beginning bloom is R1. We already mentioned this. Of course, this is triggered by shorter days, which happens after our summer begins. And so day length shortens, and that triggers the plants to produce a blossom. And these blossoms would typically occur in the middle part of the main stem. So anytime you see a blossom open, that would be R1. And we'd expect that from July 4th to July 15th, typically. All right, and then R2 is when we find an open flower on the upper two nodes of the plant. We designate an upper node where the trifoliate leaves are opened. Like this terminal bud here, the leaves are closed yet, so we would not count this node. So here's node 1 and 2, and when we find a blossom there, we'd be at R2. And by the way, in the descriptions, the blue underlining is referring to the description of the stage, and then the black relates to biology or to some management things to think about. So at R2, the plant already has accumulated 25% of its total dry weight of nutrients. Even a plant this young is hard at work. It very rapidly is taken up NP and K as well as dry matter. So what if we have defoliation at this time? Well, it's not good, but if we're going to get defoliation now, it would be much better than later on. As even 50% defoliation, they've measured to have only single-digit yield loss. Now moving on to R3, okay, that's an odd number, something new is happening. In this case, pods are beginning to form. And so officially, if the pod is, basically if you can see it and it's present on the upper 4 nodes, the main stem that have leaves that are open, that would be the beginning pod or R3 stage. And then R4 is when the pods start rapid development, and once they get to at least 3/4 inch in length. And so at this stage, things are happening more and more rapidly. And this is really a crucial stage for yield. And so if we have any type of stress from R4 to R6, this is where our most likely to have yield reduction. So agronomically, we don't want to have everything's in place, certainly by the R3 to R4 stage. And then there's some things we just can't manage, such as hail and other bad things. Okay, and then moving on, another odd stage R5, so that's the beginning of seed. And actually at the end of R4, there is some seed that actually develops, but we document as R5 when we can pull a pod from the upper 4 nodes of the plant, and you can either dissect the pod or just hold it up to the sunlight, and you should be able to see the seeds that should be at least 1/8 of an inch in length. So there's a lot of things happening, as you can imagine, at R5. The plant now is starting to move all the photosynthates and nutrients that it's produced or drawn up and moving those to the seed for seed development. So if we have leaf loss for whatever reason at this stage, we're in big trouble yield-wise, as is indicated. Also, the plant is at maximum height, maximum node number, and it's maximizing the amount of foliage that it's produced. And then also nitrogen fixation peaks at this time. And then at the end of this narrative for R5, so seed accumulation will continue until shortly after the halfway mark at R6, which is full seed, where if you dissect a pod that's located in the upper 4 nodes of the plant, the seed will fill the entire cavity of the pod. And so at R6.5, the plant now is at 80% of its total seed dry weight. And actually toward the end of R6, then the leaves will start yellowing and there may start to be some leaf drop. So this would be a timing, for example, if a person wanted to broadcast your favorite cover crop, this would be a time where you could consider that. Also note that at the middle of R6 that root growth is complete. So this is just a little graph showing, emphasizing that critical period from R4 to R6. It's about a month period when we want to minimize stress to the best of our abilities. And also note that flowering ends at about R5, vegetative growth soon after, and really the plant is ultimately busy with seed fill. And then our last couple of stages, R7, okay, something new is happening again with odd number, and that is we're starting maturity. And so to gauge maturity, basically we look up and down the plant, and if there's one pod present that has turned its mature color, that would be R7. And we can breathe a sigh of relief because our management is nearly done. Essentially, the crop is safe from a killing frost. However, if we had one at early R7 and the plant was killed, there would be expected to be some yield loss, hopefully minor, lower test weight, there probably would be less oil deposited in the seed, and there may be some green seed coats present, which could be a dock at marketing time. And finally, R8 would be full maturity when we look up and down the plant, the main stem, and see essentially all plants, except maybe 5% where the pods have turned their mature color. And then this is a sequence to showing pod and seed development. A focus is on R7 and 8, and so that's what the pods look like, as well as the seed changes. And then ultimately our last official stage is R9, and that's when the crop is ready for harvest. Seed moisture hopefully will be in that 13 to 15% moisture range. All right, last slide, my summary. Please do your homework on variety selection. The time invested definitely will give you payoff. Consider cover crops because of the many benefits. It does require more management. And then timely plant in narrow rows targeting the establishment of 150,000 plants per acre would be a really good starting point for having a good stand established out there. And then get to know your growth stages and then associated biology, because that'll give you opportunities for intensive management and ultimately increasing efficient crop yield. And that is the close of my presentation. Thank you.